Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for AI and proposal writing prompting tips and tricks. And also, thank you for joining us for Optimize. If you were able to catch some of our sessions this morning, I hope you found them valuable, and we hope that we will be seeing you tomorrow as well. So in this session, we'll be reviewing basic prompt structure and best practices, and then we're going to build on that foundational knowledge by discussing more complex prompting examples. I'll cover approach, architecture, and give you some examples and framework that you can leverage in your content creation workflows. So I'm going to go ahead and change our view here because I do have some content heavy slides and I want to make sure that you can see them really well. So let me go ahead and switch that over and we'll jump in and get started. So a few housekeeping items up front. Even though this session is pre-recorded, we do encourage you to submit as many questions as possible. I'll be following up with you with any answers, and I look forward to connecting to continue these conversations. Additional resources. I wanted to give a quick shout out to our resource center, available 24/7 on the Visible Thread website, contains blog posts, guides, past webinars, educational sessions, a whole host of great information. So if there's anything that you may be interested in or any follow-up from today, you can go over there and check that out. Recording materials for this session. So a recording of the session and slides will be available on the website as well, but you will be, you'll have that emailed to you also. Like I said, we do have some examples in the slides, so rest assured that you'll be getting copies of those. And then upcoming sessions. So tomorrow's schedule is available on the Optimize homepage and on the console here. So like I said, we would be super excited to have you come back. And tomorrow's sessions do include a product preview and look at the new Visible Thread platform in action. So we're excited about that. So continuing on with the resources, I wanted to call out a few things that are specific to prompting if this topic is something that you're interested in. So we have some blog posts, foundational best practices for prompt engineering and creating basic prompts. Then we have some real world examples with different prompt types and different ways to leverage them, also including examples, some guides for prompt engineering and prompt playbooks, and then some past webinars that also include applications and examples. Again, all of that's available on our website. If you see anything there that you'd like to explore, go ahead and take a look. Okay, now that we have all that covered, I want to move on to what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to do a quick refresh of effective prompt structure and talk about some of those best practices for basic prompting. Then we're going to move into key knowledge and everything you need to know to start complex prompting, and then take a look at some of those specific prompt architectures. So we'll walk through an example and I will give you a format and structure that you can apply and use as a takeaway from the session. So let's go ahead and jump right into our foundational refresh. So I thought it was important to start with the basics. I know we'll have folks on the call that are at different points in their AI journey. So I want to build that foundation. So what is prompt engineering? Simply put, prompt engineering focuses on how you communicate with the AI. So since these models don't think like humans, the way that you frame your instructions, so structure, wording, context, and constraints are going to dramatically affect the results that you're getting. The good news is that when we get it right, good prompt engineering can save you hours of rework and frustration when you're generating content, improve the accuracy and compliance in your proposal and technical writing, turn some of those generic responses that you might be used to getting into things that are more structured and tailored. And then over time, as you continue to iterate, you can create reliable automation and repeatable workflows and processes that are really going to benefit your team. So in order to do that, there are some things that we need to consider and basics that we need to remember. So I want to walk through those. First, we always need to be clear and give specific instructions. So we have to be precise on what we want to see, but even more than that, we need to create guardrails so the model is clear on what we don't want to see. So we only want to communicate what's essential to perform the task at hand. Always be direct. I like to think of it this way, and when we're talking about quality checking. So a way to quality check yourself and quality check your prompt is to read through the prompt. Put yourself into the shoes of the model, Obviously, the style won't be as conversational, especially when we get into more complex prompting. But if you were asked to perform the task at hand with, only the context given, would it be clear what you're being asked to do? Could you right away see some ambiguities? And if you were asked to do this, where would you need to ask follow-up questions and where would you need more information? If you can do those things, you can start to poke holes in the quality of your prompt and really see where you can iterate to improve the result. So when we do that and we leave parts of our prompt open to interpretation, that's where the model can really go off course. So the information being generated is prediction based on the model's source material and pattern recognition. It's not a nuanced consideration of the ask. It's not capable of that. So you have to quality check yourself and continue to adjust as needed. Next, we must consider style and tone when creating instructions for the model. So when you're creating generative AI content, you're dealing with a model that has millions of examples to reference. If you don't give instructions on the style of the content, the model is going to be left to predict. And right now, if you're a little bit frustrated about poor results, that may be a part of why. So you have to consider the type of document that you're working with. So are you looking for factual answers or more open-ended conversation starters? Do you want the model to have room to be creative and to help you generate new ideas? Or is there a very specific set of facts that you need to be included? So as always, by design, Gen AI will never be perfect, but you're going to get a much more relevant result if you give that context around desired style and tone, and make sure the model is aware of your ideal output. Always remember that context is key. So context is king in this situation, and this will become a theme throughout today's session, but it is critically important that we give the model all of the context it needs to do the job at hand, to do what we ask. So look at this like you've been given a recipe for a dish you've never prepared. Sorry, I have some analogies in here. But you've been given a recipe and some of the instructions or steps are missing. So the likelihood of a quality or edible, in my experience, result is going to be pretty unlikely. So make sure to be specific. Give direct instructions on formatting, length, structure, and what you want to include. And always be clear if there are things that you want to exclude. We'll talk more about constraints as we move on, but that also is a critical piece of the puzzle. As I said earlier, the model is not naturally nuanced. So you have to approach this like we'll say coding, but with language. So make sure to explain any nuance that you want considered and include any necessary qualifiers. And make sure to always consider your audience. This continues that context theme, but I thought it deserved its own slide. So especially in your work, generating content for proposals, technical documentation, white papers, and all of the great things that you're going to be working on. Just in those three examples, the audience is very different. So are we writing for evaluators? Are we writing for engineers? Are we writing for executives? Are we writing for the customer with their ask, their style in mind? So with good content, the style, tone, and language will be shaped to appeal to that intended audience. In order to do that, you can assign personas to agencies and individuals. You can include information about the angle from which they're approaching the content. An example that I'll talk about later in the deck talks about acting as a contracting officer, reviewing a section for compliance specific to a certain FAR. So in that instance, we've given a role, the contracting officer, and then we've framed the review to assess that content for a specific piece of compliance. So that's just one example. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And this can show up in a lot of ways, but it really is incredibly useful to improve the quality and, more important, the relevance of your content. At the most basic level, a good prompt generally does three things. It's going to contain a task or question for the AI to perform. It's going to frame the context of your request, and it's going to give any relevant detail or constraints that the AI needs to create the most relevant output. Now, we'll get into how we can expand on what a prompt can and should contain as we transition to more complex structures, but this is a great starting point to kind of sanity check your basic prompts and helps you to build a useful, repeatable foundation. So I'm going to cover a quick example of a basic prompt and some of the ways that we can iterate on it. So I have a basic prompt here: create an audit report on the safety of the Sizewell nuclear power stations in Suffolk, England. So I've given instructions, create an audit report and a bit of context, a little baby bit of context, the facility location. This is a foundational start, but we can add additional framing and enhance this to improve the prompt and make it much more relevant. So our second iteration here, we've created an audit report on the safety of the Sizewell nuclear power station, Suffolk, England. The recipient is the Office for Nuclear Regulation. So I gave our same instruction and context, but I've added relevant detail in the overseeing agency. This way we can factor in the preferences of the agency and any types of things that will be relevant to that in structure, tone, etc. But we can continue to enhance that with additional framing. So same front end, audit report, same place, same office, but now we're getting into the actual contents of the report. So the report must focus on safety, quality, downtime, and environmental risk mitigation. An ask like create an audit report is very broad. So it's important that we add information about what we want the focus to be and what things are most important to us. And this bit of context can help to point us in that direction. And then in our last space here, same front end, all of our information has stayed the same. Our focus is the same, but we've added some framework and a constraint piece. So the response must have headings for each focus and be less than 2,500 words. The thing to remember with this is an example of how we can enhance the output for this specific ask. So we've added new elements and we have added more context to our prompt, but we haven't introduced any new ideas or additional concepts. So even as we look at the more complex prompts we're going to cover that have, multiple steps and multiple pieces of context and information, the core ask is the same. And that's something that we always have to remember as we're working through prompting. Now that we've covered the basics, I want to begin to build on that knowledge just to kind of refresh. Simple prompts ask for direct answers. As we move into complex prompting uses structure to steer the model's thinking process. So it's going to combine different prompt types, for example, instructional, contextual, hypothetical, or iterative, to achieve some of those nuanced goals, like a technical analysis or a narrative generation. We want to make sure that we reduce ambiguity while maintaining coherence across some of those longer tasks. And quick plug back to the reference information. I mentioned some prompt types. I will be talking about a few of those here, but some of our previous content, the 1 and 2 blog posts with different prompt types and examples cover some of those types as well. Moving into talking about complex prompting. So in order to do all of this, there are some key considerations that we need to keep in mind as we move on to looking at our framework. So number one, the model isn't smart. I know that it does a lot of things and contains a ton of information, but on its own, it isn't smart. It's context driven. Like I said earlier, Gen AI models don't know things. They predict the next word based on patterns. So just like with those basic prompts that we looked at, when we get into adding more layers to that prompt structure, we need to make sure that we're continuing to add that context that's going to enrich and refine our request, but we don't ever want to lose sight of our intended end product or goal. Complex prompting at its base level is about controlling context, framing, and sequencing to guide those predictions towards your intent. Again, approach this like you're programming behavior through language, not giving commands per se, but you're defining constraints and logic with words. So the next thing we want to consider is that chain of thought is not a brain dump. When I say this, what I mean is that chain of thought is a technique that we can use to get better reasoning from our model by guiding the AI to break down those complex problems or asks into manageable steps rather than jumping to the final answer. So this approach helps to model human behavior. So logical steps that you would follow when achieving a task, by articulating each step as part of answering a question or working through that specific task. So we're asking the model to think through the reasoning before giving the final answer. That's going to help to provide a framework for our reasoning, creates a more structured, verifiable result as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the verification layer and those things as we move on. So very important are context windows. So context windows are everything. Is not an understatement. When we're talking about complex prompting, the context window refers to how much text or information that the model can process or consider at one time. So what do I mean and why is that important? Because it is going to directly determine how much information and background or how many instructions or documents can be used simultaneously to create a response. That's going to be very important when we get into referencing multiple documents, when we have multiple steps in our instructions, and there's a lot of different things to cross-reference and consider. That amount, as far as what can be input and what's allowed in our context window, that amount is measured in tokens. You may have heard that term before. It simply refers to words or parts of words. So how many words or parts of words can be considered for our request? So once we've reached that limit, additional text is ignored. That's the important part. So once we've reached our limit, additional text is going to be ignored or dropped from the analysis completely, which means that you will likely get inaccurate or incomplete results. So when you're working with complex prompts, you can attack this in a few ways. We can summarize or compress earlier sections. We can work in that modular framework to break up long tasks into smaller segments and use labeling, as well as leverage that chain of thought approach we discussed on the last slide and work through a modular prompt design. So these approaches will help us to build that multi-step reasoning without losing our fidelity or losing any information. So next we want to touch on modular prompt design. It's almost like I designed it myself. So what is modular prompt design? A modular approach speaks to the structure of your prompt. What we want to do is we want to break that prompt into specific segments. Each segment then is going to be focused on a specific function or behavior. So I have an example on the screen. Let's read through this. So our base prompt is going to define our role and our rules. Our instruction blocks are going to be task-specific guidance. Our input block is going to be user or source data, and our output block are going to be formatting requirements. Now, we're going to get into much more detailed examples of this, but this is just a basic look at those layers. So this technique is going to make your prompts easier to reuse, give absolutely more control, and it's going to improve the consistency of those results. The structure and traceability of that is going to make it easier to develop and debug those prompts as you continue to iterate. So when we modularize, it makes it easier for us, to identify where things are going wrong as we begin to work through and iterate in our process. So like I said, once you've modularized, you can reuse or swap some of those components, kind of like building blocks per se, especially when you get into enterprise workflows and complex prompts for things like proposal outlines or compliance matrices. Those are going to be outputs that need to have multiple steps and reference multiple documents in different places and source documents. So a couple more things to remember. With any work leveraging Gen AI, you must be ready to iterate. Complex prompts are going to behave differently across different models, temperatures, and with different formats. You have to understand how to use some of your optimization levers to test for the best outcomes. So you want to test, you want to iterate, you want to try different things and different combinations. And then you have to start tracking what works and refine your tone, structure, and constraints to eventually stabilize that performance. So as I said earlier, think of yourself as a programmer. So that would be the same testing process, but we're using words and language instead of code. And finally, a few slides ago, we talked about the 3 things that a basic prompt needs. In complex prompting, the checklist is a little bit different. So with a complex prompt, you aren't done until the output is structured, traceable, and can be validated. When we're talking about validation, I mean that you should always be adding a self-check phase. So don't just leverage the model for the creation piece. Prompt the model to assess your output to make sure that all the instructions have been followed and that you can identify or have help identifying any missing elements. You want to use your reference documents to validate and do cross checks, especially when you're working with sensitive and high input outputs. Ultimately, if there are things that are very important from a factual or a data perspective, we want to make sure that we're cross-referencing and putting in those validation layers to catch any inconsistencies. And always understand that, Gen AI will hallucinate a certain percentage of the time. So you likely may need some element of a manual review depending on the type of content that you're creating and how important accuracy is. Regardless of the method, the final quality gate boosts consistency and accuracy. And we'll show that in our example, how that sort of works in practice. Now that we've covered kind of our foundational information, I want to build on that knowledge and get into prompt architecture and some real world examples. So in this section, we'll start with the dimensions of a complex prompt and then build on that with architecture, a modular framework, and then talk about prompt types, extensions, and some things that we can do as we start to iterate and improve our prompts. So first, start with the kind of baseline here, the 4 dimensions of complex prompts. So when you're designing these more sophisticated prompts, you should think in layers. As discussed earlier, understanding the different types of prompts and being able to layer them effectively will help you to build these more advanced prompts and give you more control. So in general, complex prompting has 4 basic dimensions or layers that we want to consider. So the instructional layer, the instructional dimension, is going to control our directives and formatting. In this specific example, it would be create a table with 3 columns labeled XYZ. Our contextual layer is going to speak to our background, tone, roles, or scenarios. You're a federal proposal evaluator reviewing technical compliance. And then our sequential dimension. So this is where our logical flow or steps will come in. First, identify requirements, then map to evaluation criteria. So supplying that logical problem solving to the prompt. Constraint-based. So then our constraint-based layer, and I said we would cover this more, this is where our boundaries and rules are going to come in. So in this example, limit to 300 words, avoid generic statements, cite FAR clauses. We have given boundaries, we've given rules, we've given you must do this, you must not do this. It's very important as we get into complex prompting. So we've talked a lot about the components and the science of prompting, but mastering how these interact is where the art comes in. I know a lot of people say that prompting is a science and an art. Mastering how these work together and how you can layer them effectively is really where the art comes into the process. Back to my baking an analogy recipe, if you'll humor me for a second. So the prompt types and structures are the ingredients, but knowing how to combine them into an amazing recipe is the art. Now that we've covered the components of our prompt, let's talk about the architecture. In this table, I've outlined the layer, purpose, and given an example for each. Let's walk through this. So we're going to talk about our architecture here, the components, and then we're going to continue to build on this to show you the modular design and then the prompt in action. First, our role definition layer. Our role definition layer is going to establish who the model is in a given scenario. So this creates a lens of evaluation to improve the relevance of our results. In this example, you're a senior federal proposal evaluator with deep knowledge of Section LLM compliance. Now we're going to move into our context layer. So our context setup layer. This is going to give us our background and intent. So what do we need to do? You are reviewing the attached SAL to identify performance objectives and deliverables. Now moving into our task instruction layer. So the task instruction layer is going to direct the core action. What exactly do you want me to do? I want you to extract all mandatory deliverables and organize them by section number. So there's our core task or ask. And then our constraint layer. So our constraint layer is where we're going to define our limit and style, but also set boundaries for the AI as far as our output is concerned. So limit to 300 words, use bulleted lists, avoid generic language. Into our output formatting layer. So the output formatting layer is going to ensure consistency. So how exactly does it need to look? In this example, we want this output to be a markdown table. We want columns for section, requirement, evaluation, relevance. So make sure that we are highlighting exactly what we want as far as the formatting and output is concerned. And then that verification step. So that verification step adds self-logic to the command. So this is going to help to improve the quality of the work and helps to combat some of those inconsistencies. So in this instance, before finalizing, verify that all SAL sections are accounted for and label any uncertain areas. Now, we're going to continue to build on this, and I want to look at, what does that look like in practice and an actual prompt structure. So in the previous slide, we had all of our roles, and this is what that looks like in an actual modular structure, Now, I mentioned at the top of the session that you could use this as an example. You absolutely can. So this is a modular structure that gives instructions to the exact type of information to input at each step. And within the components of this prompt, you can see the brackets to show you where kind of to put that information in. So you can reuse this, you can adapt this right away. So within the brackets, I've given instructions of the type of information you need to enter. So you can adapt this for your specific workflow. And rest assured, in the next step, we will be looking at this in a real world example all filled in. So I've outlined the 6 layers from our previous chart, so we're continuing to build on that so we can follow that formula. First, we have our role definition. So we're outlining a role in a specific domain. Next is our context. So what is the scenario or task background, and what is our desired outcome? Next, what are our instructions? So what type of analysis, mapping, and validation do we need, and in what order? Then we're going to move on to our constraints. So what rules do we need to follow on length, tone, and structure? What do we want to avoid in our output, and what are our overall objectives? Then we have our output format. So how do we want this information to be presented, and make sure that we're going to include specific information around that, as well as headings, names, etc. So the more specific you can be here, the closer the output that you're given is to what you're imagining or hoping for. And then finally, we have our validation or our quality check. And that is going to confirm that, our tasks are complete, we have alignment, and that we're noting gaps or assumption to make sure that we're validating appropriately. I encourage you, please take the structure, enter the information relevant to your process, and, give it a try, start to play around with it. And you can tweak the parts, try, new information, add additional context, and then you can start to kind of experiment with this approach. I used the outline here, and now that we see the format, I want to take a look at a real world example using this exact same framework. On the right-hand side, you can see that I highlighted our 6 layers, so it's easy to follow along with the structure that we just worked from on the last slide. We have our role definition at the top. You are a federal proposal manager with expertise in DoD solicitations. Then we move into our context. So I'm telling the AI what sections to consider. So here we're C, L, and M, and I've highlighted what those sections are. And then we move down to the task. So the task, and those are our instructions. So I'm telling the model exactly what I want to do and the sequence of the actions that need to be taken. Identify required volumes, map evaluation factors or proposal content, summarize performance requirements, cross-reference GSAL requirement with the relevant evaluation areas. We want to move down to our output format. So the output format is, we want to see this in a markdown table, and these are the columns and the headings for those columns. Our constraints, what should be considered. Limit explanations to 1 to 2 sentences per cell. We don't want to get too wordy, and note any ambiguities or missing link. This is going to kind of go hand in hand with our verification layer and our quality check. How are we ensuring the best results? So ensure all evaluation factors have a corresponding SAL or technical linkage. We have here in our constraints, we want you to note any ambiguities or issues, and then verify that all evaluation factors have a corresponding SAL or technical linkage. This ties back to our task. So we've asked for cross-referencing. If there's an area where we cannot cross-reference or the information isn't available, we need that to be called out for us. Here, we've taken a complex ask and structured it in a way that's digestible and traceable in order to get the highest quality result. And again, using that previous framework, this is highly repeatable once it's refined and giving you the output that you would like. Now, We are going to run this prompt as our example, but I first want to give you a few more examples of the types of prompt components you can use to further kind of enrich and enhance a complex prompt. We've talked about several goals. I want to talk about some additional kind of prompt types you can use to achieve those. Moving on here, another table. I'm sorry, I promise we're almost at the end of the tables, but I wanted to give you as many examples as possible to make sure that you had some good takeaway collateral. So when you're thinking about how to extract the information needed to perform your tasks, there are several prompt types that you can leverage. Again, this is back to the building blocks. So putting these together, mixing them all up in our recipe. I promise I'll stop with the recipe to get a format that's going to give you your desired output. Again, you're going to have access to these slides, so I'm not going to go into all of them now, but I wanted to highlight a few. So the first one is sequential chain prompting. This can be especially effective when we're breaking those larger tasks into logical steps. With the type of work that you're doing and the type of outputs that you're creating, this is something that you will leverage quite frequently. So it's going to guide the AI to work through a complex ask in the most logical manner. We've talked about that a bit before in our previous sections when we discussed chain of thought. And this is going to give us the framework of how we can most clearly structure our instructions. And again, another example of first summarize the RFPs, evaluation factors, then identify how they map to technical sections. And we saw that in our example. We've talked a lot about assigning a role to the AI, but I want you to think about giving even more direction or context in this case to frame the way that the model approaches your ask. So this is the example that I talked about in the top of the session. Act as a contracting officer reviewing this section for compliance with FAR Part 15. That is not only assigning a role, but it's giving more context and direction on how the review needs to be approached. So the next one that I want to highlight is meta prompting. Meta prompting is incredibly useful, but I don't find as many people, at least in my day-to-day, who are fully leveraging it. So when we're creating and managing complex prompts, AI can help you get off the blank page just like it does with content creation. Try and play around using your model to help you build and validate prompts the same way that you would use it to generate content. It's a great exercise and can really help validate and quality check your prompts as well as create them. And finally, the last one I'll touch on is hybrid context chaining. So hybrid context chaining will be another thing that is important in the types of documents you're creating because it can help you to combine multiple documents and give instruction on how they need to be incorporated into the analysis. So this is going to be helpful when you're factoring in multiple source documents or you need the prompt or the model, to cross-reference multiple types of source documents. And here, last chart, I promise, just a few framework extensions and options to identify weaknesses, add additional context and perspective, and kind of stress test the resilience of your prompts. Again, just some additional approaches that you can try as you're going to test and iterate. And I just wanted to give you a few more takeaways and examples. Okay. We've covered structure and the different types of prompts that we can use to build. Now I want to look at that specific prompt in action. So I said we were going to put that to action and look at what kind of result we got back. So I've run this prompt through VT Writer, but obviously you can use any model that you have access to in the same way. Some context for those on the call who have not used VT Writer before, we are in creator mode, leveraging the LLM to run the prompt and create our content. So on the left, you're seeing our prompt library. This allows us to easily jump to prompt structures that are tested and work well as share them among team members. So that's a huge efficiency gain for frequent or more experienced users, as well as a way to upskill folks who may be newer to leveraging the technology. So within my prompt library is my shortcut to my CLM analysis prompt that I created as an example. When I select that, it will populate my box below. It'll populate the chat box below. Now, this prompt calls for analyzing a solicitation. So I'm going to select use files, and I've directed you down to where use files is there in the chat bot. So I'm going to select use files at the bottom of that chat box in order to select the appropriate document. When I do that, this window pops up and I can pull from my environment or from any SharePoint folder that I have permission to access. Those documents can then be used to create these collections that we'll see that I'm able to easily reference as source documents without having to kind of reselect or search with every new task. So I'll go ahead and select collections here. And then we'll see my collection of documents. So collections helps you to group relevant documents and reuse them for analysis or context. And that's super important when you're grounding your created content in the appropriate data. So in this case, and as is highlighted on the screen, I'm using one solicitation doc. You can incorporate multiple documents into your prompt and then add them to the analysis via collections. So for this specific prompt, if you were using another model like ChatGPT or something like that, you would upload the solicitation doc and then run the prompt on that document if your model has that capability. Now we're back on our create screen and we can see my collection containing my document referenced below my prompt as our source material. Then all I need to do is run the prompt and we get our output. So in our prompt, we ask the model to create a table with volume, section, evaluation factors, and et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, we gave limitations on the length of the responses and asked to map to those evaluation factors. We're looking to highlight ambiguities or missing links as well. We can see here that we have our table working through those sections. The length and context is correct, and the verification information and some of the misses that we had are listed below our table. We can see there, for instance, that in our ambiguities, we had some issues with the contract phase. The contract phase-in plan didn't have explicit SAL references, and then we had some broken links from the past performance to the statement of work. Additionally, and critically important, I've highlighted here and zoomed in on the reference bubbles in our table. So those reference bubbles are directing us to the documents in order to track the sourcing, especially when we're using multiple documents or have multiple input or source documents. You can track where this information is coming from to easily verify its validity. So we can continue to work this prompt, iterate, add some of our framework extensions to check our work. But for now, this is a good example of how to execute a prompt. Some key takeaways and closing thoughts on today's session. So remember that prompting is design, not guessing. So as we said earlier, the model isn't smart, it's context driven. It's going to predict based on patterns, and it needs context, framing, and sequencing to arrive at your desired destination. Always think modularly. If you perfect those building blocks or components, you can reuse them in multiple ways for a variety of outcomes and outputs and jobs. It's always important to remember that boundaries and rules create consistency and quality. So make sure you are constraining effectively and leveraging those validation prompts to make sure that you're testing your outputs, and try to approach prompting like an engineer. So test your prompts, use validation to catch mistakes and inconsistencies, and make sure to experiment with a variety of approaches. And always, please give yourself some grace. You aren't going to get a perfect output the first time, but if you do put the time in and create those building blocks and foundations and perfect your structures, you can turn this complex prompting into a competitive advantage. And always remember, AI doesn't replace expertise, it simply amplifies it. Again, thank you so much for joining me for this session. I will follow up on questions, and I invite everyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. I share resources on prompting, among other things, and I'm always excited to connect with other folks in the space and anybody who's interested in this topic. Also, I hope you'll join us for tomorrow's sessions. The schedule for those is on the console and can be found on the website and on LinkedIn. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining.